Good morning everybody and welcome to this 1010 webinar of today. My name is Els and I'm the moderator of today in absence of our colleague Natalie, who is ill. Today's 1010 webinar is about the CEN CENELEC response to standardization requests. So I would like to present you the two speakers of today. My colleagues Carolina and Alexandra are presenting you today the topic that I mentioned. Thank you.
Good morning and thank you, Els. My name is Carolina Krzystek and today, together with my colleague Alexandra Trau, we will have a pleasure of talking to you about rules for execution of standardization requests given by the European Commission to CEN and CENELEC. The structure of our presentation is threefold. We will begin by explaining some general rules that apply to all standardization requests, and then we will move on to some specific elements that apply to standardization requests for harmonized standards, as well as to requests for which European Commission and EFTA funding support was granted. So what are the standardization requests? In fact, this is a concept introduced by the new regulation on European standardization, the regulation 1025, and they are what was previously referred to as mandates. We often still refer to them as mandates. They are issued by the European Commission just like mandates were before 1st of January 2013. The main difference being that the standardization requests are legal acts, so they are adopted as European Commission implementing acts, whilst mandates were simple letters. That means that they have a slightly different reference. Now you will see that every standardization request has this CE reference number that you can use to search them through in the official journal of the European Union, but they also have the M sequence number that we use mostly for internal purposes and also for reporting with the European Commission. So you will still see that we have the M/numbers. They are prepared in consultation with CEN and CENELEC, and if you'd like to find out more about the preparation phase, I would like to invite you to listen to the recording of the previous webinar that took place on 10th of March on the preparation of standardization requests. So we'll not talk about this part here. We will talk about what happens once the standardization requests become accepted. And in fact, that means that they commit CEN or CENELEC or both to publishing the requested deliverables within specified deadlines.
Good morning. The standardization request has a formatted structure. This means that there is a set of information that we will always find in these documents. So you always find the objectives, a note regarding the acceptance of the request, the expiration conditions, the description of the requirements and the requested work, and then the arrangements for the execution of the request, so the instructions of what should be done. We'll talk in more detail about all these topics during our presentation. So starting with the objectives of the standardization request. The standardization request has to include at least one standardization deliverable. This does not mean that you cannot include pre-normative or programming work, so this is still possible, but be aware that at least one standardization deliverable has to be described in the standardization request. Ancillary actions, so supporting actions, are also foreseen by the Commission, for instance, to identify the standardization needs in new areas, or to analyze whether the subject matter is market relevant. So, but what you have to bear in mind is that these supporting actions are not standardization requests. So these are not legal documents.
And now moving on to one of the most key elements of standardization requests, it's a work program. In fact, in every request you will see a table like that that the Commission will prepare in consultation with CEN and CENELEC, and in this table on the left-hand side they will list the subject matter of the deliverables they would like CEN or CENELEC to provide in response. This table is usually rather general, and it also includes in the right-hand column the deadlines against which these elements have to be provided. And in fact, what every request will ask for is to provide the European Commission with a proposal of execution of this work program. So this table will have to be turned into a list of concrete deliverables that we will propose, and at the least it should include a title and a scope, and any change to this list, to this work program, will also have to be communicated to the European Commission. Bearing in mind that any new topic that is added to the list of deliverables after the standardization request was published should in principle be subjected to a new standardization request. So the standardization requests are quite strict and quite closed in that sense, so we cannot add any completely new topics. However, sometimes some standardization requests might be a bit more open and foresee certain conditions to add new elements. But the European Commission will have to always agree to such an addition. And just to show you on an example what it looks like, we have taken screenshots of an existing standardization request, and here you can see how these headings look like. The Commission under point 5.2 is requesting us to provide a work plan. That's the kind of description of how the work will be organized. And under point 5.3, setting a concrete deadlines of 10 months, they want us to submit a work program. Such a work program would be officially submitted by the CEN/CENELEC Management Center, of course after gathering content from the relevant technical bodies. Here you will see that in a standardization request, the Commission also specifies deadlines for submission of reports, and we will go into a bit more details in a minute. And you can see that these deadlines are specified both for the Commission who need to respond to us within 1 month after submitting the work program, but also for us, we need to report to them on the progress of work annually. The first report they want to have after 14 months. That was the agreement. And here you can see what a table with a requested work program looks like. So it doesn't specify the titles or the scopes, it just specifies the type of deliverable and the subject matter on the left-hand side and the deadline. So this deadline is binding, and we need to respond by providing a list of concrete deliverables in the left-hand column. Now, I already started talking about the reporting, and in fact, this is one of the other key elements to fulfill a standardization request. Reporting on progress of work is also obligatory under the new standardization request. The Commission is quite strict about it. We need to periodically provide them with the progress regarding status of the work items, the scope of work in case that was modified. We need to provide them with some further planning, so forecast for the next steps of the work items, and depending on a request, possibly also with the stakeholders that are involved in the work. This should be done usually annually, and this reporting should go on until the provision of the final report. Progress reports, just like work programs, are submitted to the European Commission by the CEN/CENELEC Management Center, so that will be done physically by the program manager in charge, but of course we count on you to provide us with the content. So the technical bodies will be contacted to provide the content.
And here we have a table with a generic time frame for the execution of the standardization request. In the first column we have the actions, in the second column we have the deadlines. So you see that the action starts with the notification of the standardization request to the ESOs. So this is the starting point, and we start counting the time from this moment onwards. We have the European Standardization Organization have 1 month to accept the standardization request or to reject it, and then up to 2 months the ESOs can submit a funding requested if needed. And as you can see, for the following events, the time frame is set in the standardization request. So this is done on a case-by-case basis. So being these next events, the provision of the work program, the reporting, and the publication of the deliverables.
I've already mentioned that standardization requests, once accepted, are binding to the European standardization organizations, and in fact, therefore, compliance is one of the key elements to assess whether CEN or CENELEC indeed fulfilled such a request. How is it assessed or measured? I mean, of course, the requirements set in a request shall be fulfilled, and that applies both to legal requirements specified in legislation to which such a request makes reference in case the legislation exists, but also standardization requests may include some additional requirements, either in absence of legislation or just to complete these. And CEN and CENELEC then commit to fulfilling these requirements. A second element to assess this compliance is respect of deadlines, and as I already mentioned, that applies to all the elements such as reporting on the progress. First, well, of course, most importantly, publication of the requested deliverables and also provision of the work program. You're probably keen on knowing what the consequences of non-fulfillment of these elements might be. Well, there could be several. This could be, for instance, no or restricted reference of a standard in the official journal of the European Union, and that would apply in the case of non-compliance with the requirements. The Commission may impose financial sanctions, so cut, reduce financing, annual funding provided to CEN and CENELEC. But also the European Commission may look for alternative ways of fulfilling their policy goals if the standardization bodies do not fulfill a mandate. So it's really important that in case of any delays, we inform the Commission accordingly, and there is a theoretical possibility to adjust the deadlines, but the only way to do so is to request an amendment to the original standardization request, and that would basically be another implementing act. So it is possible in theory. We haven't done it yet, but bearing in mind that this is a long and administratively burdensome process. So when do standardization requests expire? Do they in fact have a lifetime? Huh? They do, because they are legal acts. They specify their lifetime, and they expire, well, when they are replaced by a new standardization request. That request will then have to specifically refer to the previous one by saying that it repeals it. They expire if none of the ESOs accepted it, and there's usually a time frame for acceptance, and if that's not met, that means the request becomes obsolete. A request may contain specific conditions for its expiration. For instance, once the work is fulfilled. And also the Commission may consider that the request has become obsolete in cases when supported legislation was repealed and replaced by a new one. And in such a case, a new request will have to be issued. Now, what happens with the old mandates? So what the ones issued before the new regulation came into force? They remain valid under certain conditions, and that means that they remain valid as regards the revisions or amendments to deliverables covered by them that are meant for the citation in the official journal. So if we have such a case, that means the Commission may still reference these in the official journal, as long as these amendments or revisions still support the essential requirements of the legislation that is concerned. Also, some of the so-called old mandates may foresee a possibility to add new projects to their original work programs. But again, here, this should be also considered case by case. So in case of any doubt, please, you're welcome to contact your program manager, and we can always clarify it with the European Commission.
Standardization requests can support legislation under the new approach. In fact, the standardization request is a precondition for the citation of the standards on the official journal. Before this takes place, these standards have to be assessed, so the compliance with the legal requirement has to be checked, and there are several ways to do this. So the first way, which is current practice, is to have external experts, so the consultants, that make the assessment before the standard is sent for citation. The second option is to have a self-assessment. So this means that the technical bodies developing the standards make the assessment themselves. So this is not for the time being, we are not using this approach, but it is expected that in the future we may start using this because it's already foreseen. And the third option is to have a direct participation of the European Commission in the standardization work. This has happened in some cases, but as said previously, it's not the current practice, but we have some cases. These standards, the candidate harmonized standards, need to have an Annex ZA. So this is the annex making the link between the standard and the regulation. Please bear in mind that the citation in the official journal is always the responsibility of the European Commission. The CEN and CENELEC sends the references of the standards candidate for citation quarterly, but it's up to the sector to decide when the new list on the official journal will be published. And here we have an example of an Annex ZA. So this annex makes the relationship between the regulation and the standard, and basically we have a table, and in the first column we have all the requirements, all the legal requirements, and in the second table we have the clauses of the standard. So this means that by following the clauses of the standard, you are fulfilling the legal requirements. As said previously by my colleague, some standardization requests may have financial support, but it is very important to highlight that this cannot be the condition to accept a standardization request. So if it is not possible to develop the work without financial support, the standardization request shall be rejected. So this is very important. If the standardization request has financial support, then it is important to align the deadlines in the grant agreement and in the standardization request. So the deadlines in the grant agreement cannot exceed deadlines in the standardization request, and these deadlines have to be strictly respected. We have to submit the request as early as possible, ideally with the acceptance of the standardization request, and the Commission has 2 months to reply.
And now we've arrived almost at the end of our presentation, so we would like to wrap up with a number of key learning points, just the highlights before we move on to the questions and answers. What is the most important to retain here? The deadlines regarding provision of work program, periodical reporting and publication of requested deliverables are binding. In case of delays or challenges in fulfilling the requirements of the standardization requests, changes to the original standardization request can only be made by way of a new implementing act. So it's not impossible, but it is rather burdensome. So please make sure to let us know early in advance if you're experiencing any troubles, and it's important to then respect the reporting to make sure we inform the Commission accordingly. Thirdly, old mandates, so the mandates issued before 1st of January 2013, they remain valid in certain circumstances, but their status is to be confirmed on case-by-case basis with the European Commission. Fourthly, as regards standardization requests in support of the so-called harmonized or new approach legislation, all candidate harmonized standards shall include a description of the link between the standard and the requirements set in the applicable legislation. So that would be the Annex ZA in CEN and Annex ZZ in CENELEC. And finally, and very importantly, financial support, so need for financing, cannot be a condition for accepting a standardization request. That's because we cannot guarantee the obtaining financing. The budgets allocated by the Commission are not high enough to cover all standardization requests. So that's one important thing. And the other one is that grant agreements shall respect the deadlines set in the standardization request. So these deadlines have to be aligned and they cannot be exceeded, as was the usual practice in the past. So that's the new element. Well, and we would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this nice overview.